Chapter 3, the biological bases of behavior. This is lecture 2. Basic questions we're going to be looking at in this lecture. What are the brain imaging methods that are used to study brain structure and function? What are the cerebral hemispheres and what are their functions? What are the lobes of the cerebral cortex and what are their functions? What are the key structures and functions of the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain? What is meant by the term brain plasticity? Back in the 1800s, early 1800s, there was a very popular method of discerning personality types, traits, attributes, and so forth that individuals possessed. It was known as phrenology. So this was developed by an individual named Franz Joseph Gall around 1800. And there was absolutely no scientific basis to it whatsoever, but it became very, very popular. And what the phrenologists would do was to fill the lumps and bumps and indentations on an individual's skull, and then you could see here and here in these images that the skull was mapped out. And based on the phrenologist's reading of your skull, certain traits and attributes would be attributed to you. So this reflects that interest that we have in having somebody tell us what kind of person we are and the kind of propensities that we possess and that sort of thing. But again, there was no scientific basis to it whatsoever. So phrenology went away. But Gall was, in some sense, headed in the right direction. And that's a pun. Headed. A bad pun, but it's a pun. What Gall was suggesting is that there's certain parts of the skull that were associated with various faculties and attributes and behaviors and that sort of thing. And that was wrong in the main. But what we now know, and we now know this through scientific research in neuroscience, that there's particular parts of the brain that are primarily responsible for various attributes and behaviors and that sort of thing. So in that sense, the phrenologists had it somewhat right. Early research linking brain and behavior was largely constrained to case studies in which somebody had suffered severe trauma to the brain, and you saw this in war injuries and injuries and accidents and that sort of thing. So the sad tale of Phineas Gage involves Phineas Gage, that's the gentleman you see holding the spike there on the left, Irishman. He was a foreman of a railroad crew. They were building a railroad. This is a description of Phineas Gage before this spike went through his head. Possessed a well-balanced mind and was looked upon by those who knew him as a shrewd, smart businessman, very energetic and persistent. Then the horrible accident that involved the spike that he's holding entering his lower left cheek, exiting the top of his skull, essentially going right through his head. Thereafter, he was not the same kind of person. This is an artist's rendering of what happened to Phineas Gage. So thereafter he was fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, at times pertinaciously obstinate yet capricious and vacillating. So Phineas Gage was not the Phineas Gage that he was in advance of his accident. He became like an infant in many respects. And now we call this the frontal lobe personality. There's a particular type of, the particular set of behaviors that we can expect when somebody suffers a trauma similar to that which Phineas Gage suffered. So through these sad accidents, people interested in understanding the relationship between brain and behavior were able to write up case studies, and Phineas Gage became a very famous case study, linking particular parts of the brain with particular behaviors. He lived for some time after his accident. He was never able to hold a position of responsibility such as he did before, but he did live, and I think he lived for about 20 years after his accident, which was a surprise to everybody who knew about him. But what case studies like this suggest for us is that there's something going on when it comes to brain areas, particular regions of the brain, and particular kinds of behavior and mental activity. So what we're seeing here is an image of what might have happened to Phineas Gage when the spike went through his brain. It went through looks like the left cerebral lobe, cerebral hemisphere, and something happened in the occasion of this injury that changed him fundamentally. So you change the brain, you change the person, in essence. So again, if you believe in the methods of science and you believe that events are governed by some lawful order, as a scientist interested in understanding the relationship between brain and behavior, you want to go after this. You want to find out what is it that happened to his brain that made him thereafter a different kind of individual, fundamentally changed. So fortunately these days, neuroscientists do not have to rely on these kind of horrific accidents and injuries to understand the relationship between brain and behavior. So I want to talk about some technologies. A couple of them you're probably familiar with. Here they are: computerized tomography, positron emission tomography, magnetic resonance imaging, and the functional MRI. So these are 4 methods that are used to study brain structure and brain function. So let's talk about each one of these. This is a nice 3-dimensional cross-section of a human brain. What you're looking at is an image produced by what's called computerized tomography, otherwise known as a CAT scan. Computerized tomography images are produced using X-rays. And so that X-ray machine will take slices of whatever it is that that enters into the machine, and it'll render a nice 3D image. Other brain imaging techniques known as positron emission tomography, or the PET scan, involves a bit of a different process. Usually there's some injection of a harmless radioactive substance into the bloodstream, and then those radioactive substances bind with glucose molecules that are metabolized by the brain. Your brain uses a heck of a lot of sugar in behavior and thinking activities and that sort of thing. And so the PET scan has a screen that shows that different parts of the brain that are active light up in different colors. So you can see on this left-hand image that this red part here, there's a lot of activity around there, whereas in this brain, there's not. So this is a normal brain. This is a brain with Parkinson's disease. So this gives you a nice real-time image of what's happening in the brain because of these radioactive markers binding with glucose molecules. Another static or 3D imagery method is the MRI, or the magnetic resonance imaging. Major difference between an MRI and a CAT scan is that the MRI uses magnetic fields and radio waves to generate the images, as opposed to the X-rays used in the CAT scan. So what you're looking at here, these are images of cross-sections of a brain of somebody in their 20s, 80s, aging gracefully, and then 80s with mild Alzheimer's. So the MRI gives you those nice 3-dimensional images that you can evaluate for structural abnormalities and so forth. So here we can see, for example, that the ventricles, these are the spaces in the brain, are much larger in the older individual with mild Alzheimer's than they are in somebody with their 20s. So that means there's parts of the brain that are being destroyed by the disease. And also, since your brain cells begin to die at around age 28 and do so in increasing numbers as we age, then we see that through the natural processes of aging, the brain loses some of its mass. And then the last one is the functional MRI. This is similar to the PET scan in that when you're in the machine, The machine has the ability to capture the different parts of the brain that are metabolizing glucose, but the fMRI, the functional fMRI, does by monitoring oxygen levels in the blood. So the different parts of the brain light up are those parts of the brain that have higher levels of metabolism, and that's measured through oxygen usage. And so again, like the PET scan, you can see different parts of the brain lighting up when somebody's executing a behavior or solving a mental problem or something like that. It's a mathematical problem. So those are the different brain imaging techniques. The one that's probably most widely used these days is the fMRI, the functional MRI, and this is an example of a study, an actual study that was done. So the researchers scanned the brains of 21 volunteer wine novices, measuring sensations in the part of the brain where flavor responses apparently register. The subjects were told only the price of the wines. So the subjects tasted one wine twice. The manipulation was that they were given two different prices for that same wine. So which wine do you think that they reported that they liked better? If you guess the one that's more expensive, you guess correctly. That is, just having a higher price on the same wine led people to report that they preferred the more expensive one. But what's interesting is that parts of the brain responded differently. So not only were the subjective reports of these research participants consistent with the expectation that they'd prefer the more expensive one, but the different parts of the brain were consistent with their subjective reports. Concept check on imaging methods. Number 1, Johnny falls off his skateboard and lands on his head. At the hospital, they put him in a machine that uses a magnetic field and radio waves to produce a 3D image of his head. So what imaging technology are we using here to create a 3D image? That would be the MRI. Number 2, a lacrosse player gets hit in the head with a stick. Thereafter, images are taken of her head with a machine that uses X-rays to produce 3D images. That would be the CAT scan. Difference between the MRI and the CAT scan is that the MRI uses magnetic fields and radio waves, and the CAT scan uses X-rays. 3, the lacrosse player also suffered a concussion. Later, she participates in a study assessing the cognitive effects of concussion. As part of the study, she solves memory problems while in a machine that records the activity in her brain by way of radioactive markers. That would be the PET scan, positron emission tomography. And the last one, by monitoring blood flow and metabolic activity of the brain, this method can create real-time images of brain activity. That would be the functional MRI, or the fMRI. So let's talk about the brain. We're looking down on a head that's had the top of the skull removed, and you're looking at the two cerebral hemispheres, the left and the right. So, specialization or localization of function. So each hemisphere is particularly responsible for various things. So the left hemisphere, for example, is responsible primarily for language, computation, logical reasoning, whereas the right is responsible for spatial reasoning tasks, spatial recognition, and music. That is, for example, the detection of pitch and rhythm. So the brain has these two cerebral hemispheres, left and right. Each one is particularly responsible for various things. The convoluted surface of the brain, that is that part of the brain that most of us are most familiar with, is the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex have what are called 4 lobes. And each of those lobes is responsible primarily for various functions. So we're going to talk about the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital. So in this image, let's start with the frontal. And this is where Phineas Gage experienced his trauma, or at least some of the trauma to his brain. Frontal lobe manages executive functions, thinking, planning, organizing, problem solving, regulation of emotions, behavior control, and personality. So you can see that damage to the frontal lobe will likely result in that frontal lobe personality, such as Phineas Gage experienced. Frontal lobe also has a strip right here known as the motor cortex. So this is kind of an interesting piece of real estate. That is, if you take off the top of somebody's skull and put an electrical probe to the motor cortex, the entire motor behavior, spectrum of motor behaviors is mapped out in this motor cortex. So if I put an electrical probe on any part of this, I can get a corresponding movement in that part of the body. So that's the frontal lobe. The temporal lobe will go down here. Memory, understanding, language, and hearing. For example, you'll read about Broca's and Wernicke's areas, which are in the left temporal lobe. So damage to the left temporal lobe will likely result in language impairment. Let's go up here to the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe is functioning and perception, that is, cobbling together what we hope is a reasonably accurate rendering of the world out there in our mind's eye. So making sense of the world, mathematics, spelling, and then there's a strip in the front of the parietal lobe known as the sensory cortex. And like the motor cortex, sensations are mapped out in this little strip. That is, I can take an electrical probe and apply stimulation to different parts of that sensory cortex, and you'll sense the stimulation in different parts of your body. And then back here is the occipital lobe. You can think of the occipital lobe as being that part of the brain that is primarily responsible for processing visual information. So those are the 4 lobes of the brain and some of their functions. Concept check. Can you name the lobe and one function? So let's start with number 1. What lobe of the brain is number 1? That would be the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe responsible for planning, personality, motor behavior. How about number 2? What lobe of the brain is number 2? That would be the parietal. Perception, making sense of the world, processing, sensations are 2 of the responsibilities of the parietal lobe. How about lobe number 3? At the back of the brain. That would be the occipital lobe. That is responsible primarily for vision. And number 4, that would be the temporal lobe. That is responsible for language and hearing. So those are the 4 lobes of the brain and some of their functions. So now we want to look at the brain in a little bit more depth. So we're going to be looking at some various structures in the brain below the level of the cerebral cortex. To make this job a little bit easier, I've organized these structures into 3 chunks: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. So we're going to be looking at those structures in hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain and their functions. So the hindbrain, this area down here, the lower part of the image is the hindbrain. It contains the cerebellum, the medulla, and the pons. So think of the cerebellum as the little brain. Essentially, that's what it's called because it has the same sort of convoluted surface as the larger cerebral cortex. Think of the cerebellum as that part of the brain that's responsible in coordination of movement. So if you can walk a straight line, that's due to the effect of to the action of the cerebellum. Fine motor skills as well. The medulla, this structure down here in the green, is responsible for basic biological functions: breathing, circulation, muscle tone, and so forth. So if somebody gets in an accident and they are on a respirator, chances are they've suffered damage to the medulla. If the damage is severe enough, that person will die, unfortunately. The pons is the structure in the purple here: sleep and arousal, respiration, relaying sensory information, possibly dreaming. So as you can see, the structures are specific for various things. None of them does just one thing. The midbrain. Structure that you need to know something about in the midbrain is the reticular activating system, or the reticular formation that actually runs down through the pons and the medulla. Think of the reticular formation as playing a role in sleep and arousal. So there's something that happens in the brain that puts us to sleep. There's something that happens in the brain that wakes us up. And that is the action of the reticular formation. And then lastly, the forebrain. Think of the forebrain as the largest and most complex part of the human brain. It contains the cerebrum, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the limbic system. So the cerebrum is that surface part of the brain. The convoluted surface is the cerebral cortex, which you're most familiar with. Think of the cerebrum as the seat of complex thought. So most of our higher order thinking and cognitive processing takes place at the level of the cerebrum. The thalamus, which is down here, kind of in the middle of the brain, think of that as the way station for sensory information. So all the information that's being gathered by your sensory apparatus, vision, hearing, smell, and so forth, is coming through the thalamus and then being sent off to different parts of the brain. The hypothalamus is so called because it's below the thalamus. It's down here. Responsible for the 4 F's, and this is what your author calls it, but you can think of the hypothalamus as functioning in regulating basic biological needs related to survival, such as feeding, fighting, fleeing, and mating. And then the limbic system you can think of as the seat of emotion. And the limbic system, which you'll see on the next slide, is a constellation of various structures that function in the generation of emotions and in the experience of emotional memory. So the limbic system is comprised of these structures. A couple that I want you to pay attention to: the amygdala, which is a small almond-shaped structure here in the hippocampus. And the reason why I ask you to pay attention to these is because the role of the limbic system is the experience of emotion. So, for example, somebody suffering from a disorder known as post-traumatic stress disorder has various emotional struggles in life. So largely post-traumatic stress disorder is due to some experience of trauma. It was established as a diagnosis after soldiers from Vietnam began to come home and were really having troubles adjusting to civilian life, and they had severe emotional issues that many of them dealt with using drugs and alcohol and so forth, withdrawing from society. The amygdala is functional in the storage of anxiety-related emotions. The hippocampus functions in memory. So our ability to consolidate memory, that is to form new memories, is being primarily driven by the action of the hippocampus. So memory and emotion go together in kind of an interesting way. If you think about it, if you think about your past, you may be able to draw up certain experiences that you have an emotional reaction to. You're able to do that by the joint action of the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the various structures of the limbic system. So what probably happened to Phineas Gage is this: that since the limbic system is below the level of the cortex, that spike went through the lower left part of his brain, came out through the top. What probably happened is that those neural tracts that separate or that join the limbic system to the frontal cortex were severed. So these structures in the limbic system below the level of the cortex kind of had free reign. They could fire at will, essentially, without being subjected to the kind of emotional regulation, those higher order mental processes of the frontal lobe, the frontal cortex. Concept check here. John has suffered damage to his blank. And now, because he eats uncontrollably, he has problems with obesity. So we're naming that structure in the brain. The answer is the hypothalamus. Miranda is on a respirator and cannot breathe on her own. She's probably suffered damage to her. Answer is the medulla. 3. Because her hands shake so much when she draws, Susan, an artist, can no longer create the fine pencil sketches she was known for prior to her accident. Susan probably suffered damage to her. Answer is the cerebellum. Lastly, after a severe head trauma, Riley has great difficulty with planning ahead and with judgment. He's probably suffered damage to his, that would be the frontal lobe, the frontal cortex. So the last thing I want to mention here is brain plasticity. We've been talking about localization of function, how different structures are responsible for particular functions, but the brain has incredible plasticity. That means, one, the brain has this ability to reorganize neural pathways based on new experiences. So if you go out and you learn something new, maybe you learn how to play an instrument, that activity, that experience is going to lead to actual physical changes in your brain. What about when somebody suffers trauma, such as a stroke? In many instances of stroke, you see people initially showing great decrements. Sometimes people can't talk, sometimes they've lost memory. But then over time you see them also recovering some of the decrements that they suffered immediately after the stroke. So what this means is that the brain has this incredible capacity to pick up where it left off. That is, if some brain cells are damaged or impaired or destroyed, then the brain, other parts of the brain can, like a good team member, step in and pick up for those parts of the brain that have been damaged. And then the third point here is that the brain cells change their function and shape. That is, we see actual structural and functional changes in the brain as a result of injury to compensate for the parts of the brain that are missing. There's a link I've provided to a clip, a short clip, probably about 5 minutes, on neuroplasticity, and that clip can be found in the folder for the Tegrity Lectures for Chapter 3. I'd like you to watch that. It's an interesting film. It's about a little girl suffering from a seizure disorder that has an entire half of her brain removed. And that story, like many others like it, speak to this incredible plasticity of the brain. So what we looked at today: describe the brain imaging methods that are used to study brain structure and function. Identify the two cerebral hemispheres and describe their primary functions. Know the 4 lobes in the cerebral cortex and describe their key functions. Summarize the key structures and functions of the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. Explain what is meant by the plasticity of the brain. And then we've got a couple of red font objectives. That means we haven't talked about them in a lecture, but you'll find information pertaining to these objectives in the text. 6, understand relation between heredity, environment, and behavior. 7, explain the 4 key insights that represent the essence of Darwin's theory of evolution, as well as the subsequent refinements to evolutionary theory.